All right, I'm Esmé Cowles, and I'm going to talk about Valkyrie and reimagining the Samvera community. I'm going to start with just a quick introduction to Valkyrie, what it is and why we built it, and then spend most of my time talking about some of the ramifications I think we can, lessons we can learn from Valkyrie for the broader Samvera community. So as David mentioned, it's a persistence layer for Samvera. It's the core part of the repository stack that handles storing metadata and files. It provides APIs for loading, finding, navigating between objects. And if you know the Samvera stack at all, it's a replacement for Active Fedora. One of the main features that Valkyrie provides is persistence backends that you can swap. You can change between different databases and other storage options without having to change any code in your application. So Active Fedora lets you store your data, as the name suggests, in Fedora, and also in Solr. And it does both of them in a way that I'll talk about in just a minute. Valkyrie lets you do either one of those or both if you want to. It also lets you store data in Postgres database. And then there's a number of other backends that people have been developing for things like the Redis object store, regular Rails active record databases, and then some cloud options like Amazon DynamoDB and Cloud Search. And the main way it does this is by providing some abstractions, by defining sort of the minimal set of operations that an application needs to interact with the storage and making an API for those. That involves a small set of queries for loading and navigating between objects. And that's not the kind of query you might think of that an end user would do. This is really the sort of basic navigation type of query that you need to do, like, I have an object that represents a book. I need to find all of the objects that represent its pages. That kind of query. And an important feature that it provides is a test suite, so that we can make sure that all the backends are behaving consistently, so that you really can switch between them. And so that if you want to develop a new backend, you can develop your code and run that same shared test suite against your code to make sure that it also behaves the way that applications would expect. And that's really helpful for really, Rails doesn't have the same kind of API definitions that some languages have. And so it's a way of codifying what the API is and explicitly declaring sort of how we expect things to behave. So why did we do this? It really began at Princeton when we were working on Plum, and we noticed that there were a lot of divergent use cases in the community between what we wanted to do and what other people were wanting to do. We initially focused on institutional repositories and digital collections being different use cases. Over time, that seemed less important, that was really a false dichotomy, and that really the things that were more important about divergent use cases were whether you wanted to have a user interface in your application to configure it, or whether you wanted to write code to customize the behavior to work the way you wanted. And especially metadata complexity, particularly linking between objects. Whether that's PCDM, ordering members of works, or whether that's modeling controlled vocabularies or other things as objects, the more your objects linked to other things, the more you ran into performance problems. We had a lot of problems with ingest, where as you loaded large objects, each page got slower than the last. When you got large objects loaded, they were really slow to work with. Reading them and saving them grew linearly with the number of pages. And that was all sort of related to the many members problem that I've talked about before, but basically Fedora has a problem where anytime you reference objects, it has to load them. And if you have hundreds of them, it just takes a certain amount of time to load them, and it gets slower the larger it gets. And so as we were working on these problems, we worked at all levels of the stack. We worked in the Ruby RDF processing libraries, we worked in Fedora, we worked in various parts of the Samvera gems, and really what we found ultimately was that the real problem was complexity. If you look at some of the architecture diagrams for Samvera, you see Fedora over on one side serving one role, and you see Solr on the other side fulfilling a different role. But really, they're really intertwined. Because Solr provides a query API that Fedora doesn't, and because Solr's faster in most cases than Fedora is, you wound up with Solr calls sprinkled all over the code. in the core gems, in libraries, in people's applications. And because there wasn't a clearly defined API for working with some of these things, you wound up with a lot of things that were really specific to Solr and Fedora about how to query things, how to access things. A lot of the syntax of those backends was also sprinkled around in your API, which led to some really complicated code and made it very difficult to sometimes figure out which operations were going to talk to Fedora and which ones would talk to Solr, to work on performance or really anything else. And it really made a sustainability problem that we recognized as something that should really get some attention. So we worked on Valkyrie, and it worked really well for us. We did that about a year ago, sort of in earnest, focusing on that. And I want to talk about sort of what Valkyrie as an alternative to Active Fedora means for the community. And the first thing I want to say is that Samvera is a pretty big community. There's a lot of people doing a lot of different things, and I obviously can't speak for all of them. But I do want to draw some lessons from our experience and the discussions we've had with a lot of people about Valkyrie and different persistence options. And the first thing I want to point out is that the working group process in Samvera worked really well for Valkyrie. Trey Pendragon, my colleague at Princeton, developed a prototype. He promoted it at community events and using community communication channels. A working group was formed using the established processes, and that had participants from 5 different institutions in the Samvera community. They organized sprints that had code contributions, ultimately from members of 11 different institutions, and that resulted in the release of Valkyrie 1.0 in March. And I think that that was an incredibly successful use of the process as it existed. And so as the Samvera community talks a lot over the last year or two about governance, and there's a lot of focus on changing things like how leadership is selected and having elections and rotating membership, developing a community roadmap, formalizing the contributions that people make, I thought it's important to point out that here's an example of a lot of the community institutions working really well. And so I wanted to highlight that as a thing that I think we shouldn't change. Or at least we should be thoughtful about changing it and not break something that isn't broken. The other thing I think that is really different is that Fedora is no longer the center of the universe. Fedora serves a lot of use cases well. I'm a Fedora committer and a Fedora API specification editor, and I think that Fedora has a really good place for a lot of things, but it doesn't work for everything. There's been a lot of work on an API specification and alternative implementations, but when we had to make the call about doing something different for our repository about a year ago, none of those implementations were really ready. Especially none of them had the sort of institutional support and sustainable development process that would let us use them instead of Fedora or instead of Postgres or something else like that. A year has gone by and there's been work on some of those implementations and on the API specification. But again, still today, I don't think that there is an alternative implementation that I could recommend to people that they could use today. And so I think there's some community building that needs to happen there for those to be a viable alternative to Fedora or to Valkyrie. But whether we're talking about Fedora alternate implementations or whether we're talking about Valkyrie with a larger variety of backends, I think having the ability to select your backend, just having that choice opens up a lot of possibilities. It lets you pick your backend based on the performance that you need or the features you need. Or maybe there are other things, like perhaps you have an IT shop that says you must use X or you must not use Y. Or maybe your staff has a lot of expertise in a particular technology and it makes just sense for your group to use it. Valkyrie really lets you do that. And since Fedora is no longer the defining aspect of the community, I think that that's a really big change, just psychologically, about how Samvera views itself. Fedora has been the defining aspect of the community, and Samvera was defined as a thing in relationship to Fedora, as a front end to Fedora. And as with the process of renaming Hydra to now Samvera that happened last year, I think it's an opportunity to rethink who we are and what we are related to and how. And I think that that's a good opportunity to just have some introspection and to think about how we want things to work. I think it's also an opportunity for the Samvera community to really live up to its values around stewardship of code and data. We have a lot of code to update. I mentioned that there were calls to Fedora and Solar sprinkled around applications and gems at all levels of the stack. All of those are going to need to be updated if they're going to work with Valkyrie. There will be a lot of things that will need to be modified. I think that there's been a lot of work already in Hyrax to make it support Valkyrie, but it's challenging to do that work and to do it in a way that's compatible with existing applications. And so there's also a data migration element to it. If people have a lot of deployed data using Sophia and older versions of Hyrax, the choices that we make about how we implement Valkyrie and whether we make people migrate their data again might make it very challenging for people to upgrade their software, or might make it prohibitive. It might make people just stay where they are and not upgrade at all. And that has ramifications for the community about who's on the latest software and who's engaged and who can participate in development and who gets left behind. So I think we haven't always done a good job of that, and we can do better. I think that we should do better to think carefully about the ramifications of the data migrations and the code upgrade paths in order to make it easy for people to upgrade, make it easy for people to move their data forward. There's a lesson too that I think we can learn from the Islandora community, which is don't fight against your platform. A lot of Islandora Claw development centers around taking full advantage of the Fedora ecosystem, but the sort of the companion piece to that is taking advantage of the Drupal ecosystem, of being a more typical, normal Drupal application by using Drupal the way it was meant to be used in a way that's compatible with the large library of Drupal modules that are out there. And I think that we are in a similar situation in many ways, that Rails is a large, vibrant ecosystem, and Active Fedora mimics Active Record and provides a lot of the same patterns, but ultimately it's not Active Record, and that meant that a lot of things that would work with Active Record really wouldn't work with Active Fedora. And that always cut off some tools and some options and made things challenging. And so to the degree that Valkyrie is embracing more community-maintained gems, like dry types and dry struct for doing the core data mapper functionality, the Draper gem for doing decorators, it really gives us the possibility of making Samvera applications more like standard normal Rails applications. And in addition to unlocking a huge ecosystem, it also has real implications for hiring developers and retaining them. There are a lot more Rails developers in the world than there are Samvera developers, of course. And when you hire developers and you dump them into a platform that has patterns that look like patterns they know, but then work strangely or don't work or have weird gotchas, it's deeply frustrating. And I've seen a number of cases over my experience in the Samvera community of new developers coming in and getting really frustrated with code that didn't really work the way they were used to, and having Fedora be a stumbling block for why we even used it. What was its value proposition? Why are we using this weird thing? And to the degree that we can make our stack work more like normal, quote unquote, applications, I think that that's going to help us there. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the component versus product sort of continuum. You know, there's a lot of gravity around Hyrax, and a lot of people are adopting it that had built their own applications out of components. And that's very understandable, and I think that's fine. But I also think it's important to maintain a space in the community for people who are building with components. I don't think we want to be a one-size-fits-all kind of community. I don't think that that would serve us well. And building out of components and having that be a vital part of our community, I think will help us take advantage of the Rails ecosystem, help us make software that will be usable outside of our small community, and just generally let us have a more sustainable, more productive community of software that we build. Thank you. And I'm Esmé Cowles on Twitter and, for the moment, GitHub, and also GitLab and SourceForge and a couple others. The talk slides are at bit.ly/Valkyrie-reimagining if you want to look at these links or anything else.
We have some time for questions. I'll run around with the mic, so put your hand up.
So in our conversations about roles that Valkyrie might play in the community, I'm Mark Bussey from Data Curation Experts. We were talking about the pain of the transition from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4 and the changes that that made in active Fedora. And we were discussing the possibility of looking at Valkyrie patterns as making a Fedora 4 to Fedora 5 transition easier and more sensible. Thoughts about that? Is that realistic?
I don't know. I think it might make Fedora 5 to Fedora 6 a lot easier. But I do think that there's support for Fedora in Valkyrie right now, but it's not compatible with the way that Hyrax uses Valkyrie. So I think to the degree that we can write Valkyrie backends that persist data the way Fedora 3 and Fedora 4 now work with other Hyrax applications, with other Samvera applications, I think that is a possible path for making migrations easier and letting people migrate between different backends over time. One thing that we've definitely seen at Princeton is that when you have Valkyrie working with one backend, it becomes a lot easier to move that data to another backend because there's tooling in it already for iterating and copying things between backends.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your decision process at the beginning of Valkyrie development when you were making the decision of the issues that you saw with Fedora of building your own implementation versus using those same resources to extend Fedora to meet that use case.
Sure. We had spent about a year working on performance problems of various kinds. And we wrote up a document where we sort of looked at the pros and cons of a couple of different options. So we did consider devoting a lot of time to Fedora to try to fix the performance problem that was particularly bedoubling us. We talked about implementing a Fedora alternate implementation, Cavendish specifically. We talked about Valkyrie, which we ultimately did, and we talked about just going straight active record. And we decided that going just straight active record was too large a break, both in terms of the functionality that we got from the Samvera stack and with the Samvera community. That we had seen Boston Public Library basically make the declaration that they were going to go straight to active record, and we decided that we didn't like how that felt, and we didn't want to do the same thing. We judged that working on Fedora wasn't likely to be productive. A lot of smart people had spent a lot of time working on that problem with some limited success, but ultimately without being able to really completely address the issue. And having seen a lot of people spend a lot of time on it without being able to bring it home really discouraged us from pursuing that strategy. And then I mentioned briefly that the lack of institutional support was the main thing that stopped us from using Cavendish. That there are a number of Fedora implementations out there that are one or two people's side projects, and to date, no big institution is really using any of them, and there's no community of developers around them, and we didn't feel like that was sustainable. We wouldn't want to decide, yes, we want to do this thing, and then suddenly we're the ones who have to maintain the whole thing. Whereas the working group process in Samvera let us bring a lot of other people from the Samvera community into Valkyrie and have other people share that burden with us.
Thanks, Esmé. Could you describe the adoption and scale at which Valkyrie has been used and or tested?
Sure. Princeton's Figgy repository, I think, is the main production Valkyrie application right now. We have something like 50,000 objects and 3 or 4 million pages, and something like 100 terabytes of data in it. The other main application that's being developed with it right now is called CHO from Penn State, which is also a digital collections application, but has some really different views of modeling around having sort of dynamic field and record building in the application. That's still in development, so it doesn't have sort of production scale behind it. The other uses of Valkyrie are either experimental or in development, things like working with Hyrax or other people working on applications using Valkyrie.
We got time for about one more question. Somebody wants to get the last one in.
Hi, this is Mike Giarlo from Stanford. I wonder if there are other parts of the stack that you think are ripe for reimagining the way that Active Fedora has been reimagined as Valkyrie.
You know, I'm less familiar with other parts of the stack. I think there's a constellation of small gems like Hydra Editor, Hydra Derivatives, Hydra Characterization that are much smaller and more focused. But I would say that, you know, the other core parts of the stack like active triples and the curation concerns Hyrax parts strike me as sort of the other places that I've heard people be either wary of getting into working with them or frustrated by working in them. So those were the other places I would look. All right, thank you everyone.